Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board uncovered a dark family secret that changed everything. I've always been skeptical about supernatural stuff, but curiosity has a way of nudging even the most doubtful minds. It was one of those boring Friday nights when my friend Jake suggested we try out his grandmother's old Ouija board. We were just out of high school, restless and looking for something to do that didn't involve the usual video games or underage drinking. So we gathered at Jake's place, a creaky old house filled with dusty antiques and an unsettling atmosphere. Jake's grandmother had passed away a few years back, and her belongings were scattered around the house. He pulled the Ouija board out from a pile of her things in the attic. It looked ancient, with faded letters and a planchette that seemed ready to splinter at the slightest touch. We laughed it off, calling it a cheap thrill, but deep down, I felt a knot of unease. There were 4 of us: Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, my brother Matt, and me. We sat around the board in Jake's dimly lit living room, a single candle flickering ominously in the center of our circle. It felt like a scene from a cliché horror movie, but we were too eager to be freaked out by it. Jake started with the usual, "Is anyone there?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the planchette moved. At first, we all thought someone was screwing around, but the looks on their faces told me otherwise. It spelled out, "Yes." A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off, trying to stay cool. We asked a few more questions, the answers becoming more unsettling each time. "Who are you? How did you die?" The responses were vague and cryptic, but the planchette moved with a confidence that made my skin crawl. It was when Sarah asked, "What do you want?" that things took a dark turn. The planchette spelled out family. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling a bit. The planchette began to move faster, spelling out words that made no sense at first. Then it spelled Jake. We all stared at Jake, who was as pale as a ghost. "What the hell, man? Are you doing this?" Matt asked, his voice shaky. Jake shook his head, visibly shaken. "No, dude, I swear." The board spelled out more, FINDTHEBOX. "What box?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. Before we could ask more, the planchette moved again, spelling out ATTIC. I don't know why, but we felt compelled to go. Maybe it was morbid curiosity or just sheer stupidity, but we all made our way to the attic. Jake led the way, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The attic was filled with old furniture, trunks, and cobwebs. We searched for what felt like hours, but there was no box in sight. Just as we were about to give up, Matt tripped over something. It was a loose floorboard. We pried it open and found an old, dusty box hidden underneath. My heart pounded as Jake opened it. Inside, there were old photographs, letters, and a small, ornate key. The photographs were the worst. They showed Jake's grandmother in various stages of her life, but they weren't ordinary photos. In each one, she was standing beside a man I didn't recognize, and they both had these unsettling, vacant expressions. The last few photos were the most disturbing. They showed Jake's grandmother with a baby, then a toddler, and finally, a young boy who looked eerily like Jake. "What the hell is this?" Jake muttered, his voice shaking. He picked up one of the letters and began to read aloud. It was a letter from his grandmother to someone named Harold. As he read, the truth began to unfold, and it was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. The letters spoke of a pact, a deal made with some dark entity. Jake's grandmother had promised her firstborn in exchange for wealth and protection. The man in the photographs was Harold, her brother, who had helped her perform the ritual. The boy in the photos was Jake's father, who had apparently escaped the fate intended for him. The last letter hinted at unfinished business, a debt that still needed to be paid. Suddenly, the candle in the living room went out, plunging us into darkness. The air grew cold, and a foul smell filled the attic. We heard whispers, low and unintelligible at first, but they grew louder, more insistent. We scrambled out of the attic, slamming the door behind us. Back in the living room, the Ouija board was waiting. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out a final message. H-E-I-S-H-E-R-E. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel eyes on us, watching, waiting. We were in too deep, and there was no turning back. That night was just the beginning, and what followed would haunt us forever. I'll post more soon. Stay tuned. The night after we discovered the box, none of us could sleep. We kept hearing things, creaks in the floorboards, whispers in the dark, and what sounded like footsteps just outside our doors. I tried to tell myself it was just our minds playing tricks on us, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The next morning, we gathered at Jake's house again, determined to figure out what the hell was going on. Jake looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were bloodshot and he was visibly shaken. Sarah and Matt didn't look much better. We decided to go through the rest of the letters and photos, hoping to find some sort of explanation. As we sifted through the box, we found more disturbing details about Jake's family. Apparently, his grandmother and her brother had been involved in some seriously dark shit. The letters detailed various rituals they performed, all in the name of gaining power and protection. The more we read, the more it became clear that whatever they had summoned was still around, and it wanted Jake. There was one letter that stood out. It was dated just a few months before Jake's grandmother died. In it, she begged Harold for help, saying that the entity was growing impatient and that it had started to target her family again. She mentioned that she had hidden the key and that it was the only thing that could stop it. We had the key, but no idea what it was supposed to unlock. That night, things escalated. We decided to stay at Jake's house to keep an eye on him. Around midnight, we heard a loud crash from the attic. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and cautiously made our way up the stairs. The temperature dropped significantly as we approached the attic door. My breath came out in visible puffs, and a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. When we opened the door, the sight that greeted us was like something out of a nightmare. The attic was trashed, boxes overturned, furniture broken, and the smell of decay was overpowering. In the middle of the chaos was the Ouija board, sitting on the floor with the planchette moving frantically on its own. It spelled out a single word, D-E-A-T-H. Suddenly, we heard a deep, guttural growl. We turned around and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, with glowing red eyes and an aura of pure malice. It stepped forward, revealing its grotesque, decayed face. I felt my stomach churn, and I fought the urge to vomit. The thing looked at us with a twisted smile, and I could feel its hatred burning into my soul. We ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind us. We could hear it pounding on the door, its growls growing louder and more enraged. We huddled together in the living room, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when Jake remembered something his grandmother used to say, "The key will save us." We pulled out the ornate key from the box, examining it closely. It was old, with strange symbols carved into it. None of us had any idea what it was for, but we knew it had to be important. We spent the rest of the night trying to decipher the symbols, hoping to find some clue about its purpose. As dawn approached, the activity in the house seemed to die down. We took the opportunity to get some rest, though none of us slept well. Every creak of the house sent us into a panic, fearing that the entity would return. The next day, we decided to do some research. We went to the local library and dug through old records, trying to find anything that could help us. We found an old journal written by a man named Harold Jennings, who turned out to be Jake's great-uncle. The journal detailed his and Jake's grandmother's descent into dark magic and their pact with the entity. Harold wrote about the key, saying it was made to lock away the entity forever. He mentioned a hidden room in the basement of the family home, where the final ritual was to be performed. We knew what we had to do, but the thought of going back to that house filled us with dread. That evening, we returned to Jake's house, armed with the key and a determination to end this nightmare. We found the hidden door in the basement, just as Harold had described. The room beyond was small and cold, with walls covered in strange symbols, and an altar in the centre. We placed the key in a slot on the altar, and as we turned it, the room shook violently. The entity appeared, more furious than ever. It lunged at us, but it couldn't cross the threshold of the room. We chanted the words we found in Harold's journal, and the entity screamed in rage and pain. It clawed at the air, its form flickering and distorting. With one final, blood-curdling scream, it was pulled into the altar and vanished. The room went silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We collapsed, exhausted but relieved. The nightmare was over, or so we thought. Little did we know, this was just the beginning of the horror that would follow us for the rest of our lives. The days following our encounter with the entity were eerily quiet. The oppressive atmosphere in Jake's house lifted, and for a brief moment, we allowed ourselves to believe that it was over. We thought we had won, that we had banished the entity for good, but the scars it left behind were deeper than we realized. Jake was the first to notice something was still wrong. He started having nightmares, vivid, horrifying dreams where he was trapped in the attic, surrounded by shadows that whispered his name. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, we chalked it up to trauma, a natural response to the ordeal we'd been through. But then strange things started happening again. One night, while we were hanging out in Jake's living room, we heard a familiar creaking sound from above. The attic door, which we had firmly shut and locked, was ajar. A cold draft blew through the house, sending shivers down our spines. We stared at the door, paralyzed with fear. "Did you guys hear that?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling. We nodded, too scared to speak. Jake grabbed a flashlight and, despite our protests, made his way towards the attic. We followed him, our footsteps echoing in the silent house. As we approached the attic, the temperature dropped again. My breath became visible, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Jake pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted us was worse than before. The attic was completely trashed. The Ouija board was back in the center of the room, the planchette moving on its own. It spelled out a single, chilling word, TRAP. Before we could react, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the attic into darkness. The flashlight flickered and went out, leaving us in pitch black. We heard whispers all around us, growing louder and more frantic. The air became thick, making it hard to breathe. Panic set in. We banged on the door, screaming for help, but our voices were swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, forming words that chilled me to the bone. "You cannot escape." Suddenly, the flashlight flickered back on, casting an eerie glow on the room. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out towards us. Jake clutched the key, his knuckles white with fear. We tried to remember the chants from Harold's journal, but the words escaped us in our panic. The shadows closed in, their whispers turning into screams. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I recoiled in terror. We huddled together, desperately trying to remember the words that would save us. Just as the shadows were about to engulf us, Jake shouted the chant, his voice breaking but determined. The shadows recoiled, screaming in agony. The room shook violently, and the oppressive weight lifted. The door flew open, and we stumbled out, gasping for air. The attic door slammed shut behind us, and we collapsed on the floor, too exhausted to move. We knew we couldn't stay in that house any longer. Jake moved in with Sarah, leaving the house to collect dust and memories of a nightmare we wished we could forget. But the entity wasn't done with us. It followed us, its presence a constant shadow in our lives. Jake's nightmares got worse. He started sleepwalking, waking up in strange places with no memory of how he got there. Sarah found him in the attic of her house one night, standing in the dark and muttering in a language she didn't understand. She was terrified, but Jake had no recollection of it. Matt began seeing things out of the corner of his eye. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Figures standing at the end of dark hallways. He heard whispers when he was alone, calling his name, taunting him. He started avoiding dark places, leaving lights on even when he slept. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of a tall, gaunt figure with glowing red eyes in mirrors and reflective surfaces. The sight would send me into a panic, my heart racing and my hands shaking. I started avoiding mirrors, afraid of what I might see. We tried to move on, to live normal lives, but the entity's grip on us was too strong. It fed on our fear, growing stronger with each passing day. We knew we had to do something, but we were terrified of facing it again. One night, while we were discussing our next move, Jake had an idea. He remembered a passage from Harold's journal about a final ritual that could banish the entity for good. It required a blood sacrifice and a binding spell, performed at the exact spot where the entity was summoned. We were desperate enough to try anything. We gathered at Jake's house, armed with the journal, the key, and a sense of dread that hung over us like a storm cloud. We made our way to the basement, to the hidden room where it all began. The air was thick with tension as we prepared for the ritual. We cut our palms, letting our blood drip onto the altar. Jake began chanting the words from the journal, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The room shook and the entity appeared, more furious than ever. It lunged at us, but the barrier held. We continued the chant, our voices rising in unison. The entity screamed, its form flickering and distorting. With one final desperate lunge, it tried to break through, but the binding spell held firm. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream as it was pulled into the altar, the room shaking violently. The symbols on the walls glowed brightly, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. With one last agonized wail, the entity was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. We collapsed, exhausted but relieved. We had done it. We had banished the entity for good, or so we thought. Little did we know, the entity had one final trick up its sleeve, one last secret that would haunt us forever. After the ritual, things seemed to settle down. The house felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere gone. We tried to return to our normal lives, clinging to the hope that we had finally put an end to the nightmare. Jake moved back into his house, hoping to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. For a while, it seemed to work, but deep down, we all knew something wasn't quite right. The scars left by the entity ran deep, and the shadows of our experience lingered. It wasn't long before the signs of its lingering presence began to show. Jake started seeing things again, fleeting shadows in the corners of his vision, whispers in the dead of night. He dismissed them at first, chalking them up to paranoia, but the incidents grew more frequent and more disturbing. One night, he woke up to find his grandmother's photo on the nightstand, the glass cracked, and the frame covered in dust. He hadn't touched it since we put the box back in the attic. Sarah was the next to experience the haunting. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find Jake standing by the window, staring into the darkness, muttering to himself. When she tried to wake him, he'd snap out of it, confused and disoriented. It was as if the entity still had a grip on him, pulling him back into its dark embrace. Matt and I weren't spared either. The shadows followed us, lurking just out of sight, reminding us that we could never truly escape. Matt took to sleeping with the lights on, his nerves frayed by the constant feeling of being watched. As for me, the reflections in mirrors became a constant source of terror. I'd catch glimpses of the entity's red eyes, watching, waiting. One evening, Jake called us over to his house. He sounded desperate, his voice shaking over the phone. When we arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He showed us a letter he had found in the attic, hidden beneath the loose floorboard where we had discovered the box. It was another letter from Harold, but this one was different. It was a warning. Harold wrote about the entity's final trick, a last-ditch effort to remain in our world. He warned that if the binding ritual wasn't done perfectly, the entity could transfer its essence into an object, lying in wait for the right moment to return. Jake's face turned pale as he realized what it meant. The key. The ornate key we had used in the ritual was the conduit for the entity's final trick. We were horrified. We thought we had banished it, but instead we had given it a new way to haunt us. The key was somewhere in Jake's house, waiting for the right moment to strike. We had to find it and destroy it, but we had no idea where it could be. We tore through the house, searching every nook and cranny. The air grew colder as we searched, the familiar sense of dread returning. We knew time was running out. The entity was growing stronger, feeding off our fear. It was Sarah who found the key, hidden in a drawer in Jake's grandmother's old bedroom. The key looked different now, darker, more sinister. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, sending chills down our spines. We knew we had to destroy it, but the question was how. Harold's letter mentioned a cleansing fire, a ritual that could cleanse the object of the entity's presence. We gathered the materials we needed and prepared for the final ritual. As we lit the fire, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. We placed the key in the fire, chanting the words from Harold's letter. The key glowed red hot, the air filled with the smell of burning metal. The shadows lashed out, desperate to stop us. The entity screamed, its rage palpable. The key twisted and warped in the flames, the entity's screams growing louder, more desperate. As the key melted, the shadows recoiled, and the temperature began to rise. The oppressive weight lifted, and the whispers faded into silence. The key was nothing but molten metal now, the entity's final trick undone. We collapsed, exhausted but relieved. The nightmare was finally over. The house felt different, lighter, peaceful. We knew the entity was gone for good this time. We had won, but the victory felt hollow. The scars it left behind would never truly heal. In the following weeks, we tried to move on with our lives. Jake moved out of the house, unable to bear the memories it held. Sarah and he decided to start fresh, moving to a new town. Matt and I returned to our routines, but the experience had changed us. We were haunted by the memories, the shadows that would never truly fade. Little did we know, the entity's reach extended further than we thought. The darkness it brought into our lives left a mark that could never be erased. We had faced the entity and survived, but the true horror lay in the knowledge that some things, once touched by darkness, can never truly return to the light. Months passed, and we all did our best to move on. Jake and Sarah settled into their new town, trying to forget the horrors they had left behind. Matt and I clung to a semblance of normalcy, but the scars of our ordeal were always just beneath the surface. We avoided talking about it, as if speaking the words would give the darkness power again. One cold, rainy night, I got a call from Jake. His voice was frantic, filled with the kind of terror I hadn't heard since that night in the attic. "It's back," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's watching me." My blood ran cold. "Jake, what are you talking about? We destroyed the key. It's gone." I thought so too, but it's not over. There's something in the house, moving things, whispering my name at night. Sarah, she's seeing it too. Fear clawed at my chest. "I'll come over. We'll figure this out." I called Matt, and we drove through the pouring rain to Jake's new place. It was a small, cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, a stark contrast to the dark memories of his old home. But as soon as we stepped inside, I felt it, the oppressive weight of the entity's presence. Sarah was pale and trembling, clutching a rosary in her hands. "It started a few nights ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We thought it was just nightmares, but it's real. It's here." We sat down in their living room, the sense of dread growing with each passing minute. We needed to figure out why it had returned and how to get rid of it once and for all. Matt suggested we call someone who might know more about these things, an expert in the occult. It was our only shot. Through a mutual acquaintance, we got in touch with a woman named Evelyn, an occultist who had dealt with dark entities before. She arrived the next day, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She walked through the house, her face growing more serious with each step. "This entity is ancient and powerful," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Destroying the key weakened it, But it wasn't enough. It's anchored to something else, something you haven't found. We racked our brains trying to think of what it could be. Then, Jake remembered something. My grandmother had a locket, he said, his eyes wide with realization. She never took it off. After she died, I kept it in a box with some of her other things. We retrieved the locket from a small box Jake had brought with him. It was old, intricately designed, and it felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Evelyn examined it, her face grim. "This is it," she said. "This is the anchor. We need to perform a cleansing ritual, but it won't be easy. The entity will fight back." That night, we prepared for the ritual. Evelyn drew protective symbols around the house and lit candles infused with herbs she claimed would weaken the entity. We gathered in a circle, holding hands as Evelyn began to chant. The air grew thick and the temperature dropped, just like before. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, forming into the grotesque figure of the entity. It screamed, a sound filled with pure rage and hatred. It lunged at us, but the protective symbols held it back. Evelyn continued the chant, her voice unwavering. The locket in the center of the circle began to glow, the symbols on it burning bright. The entity screamed again, its form flickering and distorting. It clawed at the air, desperate to break free. The room shook and the candles flickered, but we held firm. The locket grew hotter, the glow intensifying. The entity let out a final, blood-curdling scream as it was pulled towards the locket, its form dissolving into smoke. With one last burst of light, the locket shattered, the pieces falling to the floor. The oppressive weight lifted, the air growing warmer. The entity was gone. We collapsed, exhausted but relieved. Evelyn smiled, her face lined with fatigue. "It's over," she said softly. "You're free." In the days that followed, the house felt different, peaceful even. The nightmares stopped, the shadows disappeared, and the whispers were gone. We could finally breathe again, free from the entity's grip. Jake and Sarah decided to stay in their new home, hoping to build a future, free from the darkness of the past. Matt and I returned to our lives, forever changed but stronger for having faced the horror together. The entity was gone, but the memories lingered. We knew that we had been lucky, that some things are best left undisturbed. The Ouija board, the letters, the locket, they were all reminders of a darkness we had narrowly escaped. As I write this, I can't help but wonder about the other dark secrets hidden in the world, waiting to be uncovered. We had faced one horror and survived, but the shadows of our experience would always be with us, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. For those reading this, take my advice. Some things are better left buried. Curiosity may lead you down a path you're not prepared to walk, and if you ever find an old, dusty box in an attic, think twice before opening it. The darkness is always watching, waiting for the right moment to return. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never, ever play with a Ouija board. The end. The Ouija board told me who's haunting me, and it's someone I know. It started last October when I moved back to my childhood home after my parents died in a car crash. The house was old, creaky, and filled with memories, but I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. The first night I stayed there, I felt uneasy. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more menacing. I chalked it up to nerves and grief. I was exhausted and emotionally drained, so I went to bed early, hoping sleep would bring some peace. Instead, I woke up in the middle of the night to a cold, suffocating presence in my room. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I felt something watching me, something malevolent. It lasted for what felt like hours before I finally managed to move and turn on the light. There was nothing there, but the feeling of dread lingered. The next day, I found an old Ouija board in the attic while looking for my childhood stuff. It was covered in dust, and I remembered my friends and I messing around with it when we were kids. We never took it seriously, just used it for fun at sleepovers. I don't know what possessed me to bring it downstairs, but I did. That night, Curiosity got the better of me. I lit some candles, set the board on the living room table, and placed my fingers on the planchette. I felt ridiculous, a grown man playing with a kid's game, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in the house, something I needed to understand. "Is anyone there?" I asked, feeling stupid. Nothing happened for a long time, and I was about to give up when the planchette started to move. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it picked up speed. Yes. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked. The planchette moved again, spelling out a name that made my blood run cold. Karen. Karen was my high school girlfriend. She disappeared without a trace during our senior year. It was a huge scandal in our small town. The police investigated for months but never found any leads. Eventually, people moved on, but I never forgot her. We had our ups and downs, but I cared about her deeply. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved slowly, as if it was struggling to communicate. HELPME. My hands shook as I continued. "How can I help you?" KILLEDME. I gasped and pulled my hands away from the board. This was insane. Karen was dead? I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. But the board continued to move on its own. TRUSTNOONE. I slammed the planchette back on the board. "Who killed you?" I demanded. The answer made my stomach drop. YOU. I froze, my mind racing. This couldn't be true. I would never hurt Karen. I loved her. But the board was insistent. YOU. The room grew colder, the shadows darker. I felt a presence behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the board, the planchette was still. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Karen, about the last time I saw her. We had a fight, a big one. She accused me of cheating on her, and I was too angry to deny it, even though it wasn't true. She stormed out, and that was the last time anyone saw her. The police questioned me, but they never found any evidence linking me to her disappearance. I tried to move on, but the guilt never left me. Over the next few days, strange things started happening around the house. I heard footsteps at night, doors creaking open on their own, whispers in the dark. I found messages scratched into the walls. "Help me. Trust no one. You did this." I was losing my mind. One night, I woke up to find Karen standing at the foot of my bed. She looked exactly like she did in high school, but her eyes were empty, her skin pale and bruised. She pointed at me, her mouth opening in a silent scream. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She vanished as suddenly as she appeared, but the terror lingered. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live like this. I needed answers. I needed to find out what really happened to Karen. I started digging through old newspapers, police reports, anything I could find about her disappearance. I contacted old friends, people who knew us back then. Most of them didn't want to talk to me, but one of them, Mike, agreed to meet up. Mike and I met at a bar downtown. He looked older, rougher than I remembered. Life hadn't been kind to him. We talked about old times, reminiscing about high school, but eventually I steered the conversation to Karen. "Do you remember the night she disappeared?" I asked. Mike took a long drink from his beer. "Yeah, I remember. She was upset about something, said she needed to talk to you, clear the air." I nodded. "We had a fight. She thought I was cheating on her." Mike's eyes narrowed. "Were you?" "No," I said firmly. "I would never do that to her." Mike seemed to believe me. "Look, man, I know you cared about her. But something always felt off about that night. I heard she was meeting someone else after she left your place." "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "I don't know," Mike said. "But there were rumours. People said she was seeing someone else. Someone dangerous. Dangerous!" The word hung in the air like a curse. I thanked Mike and left the bar, my mind racing. Who could Karen have been meeting? And why did the Ouija board say I killed her? I went back to the house, determined to get to the bottom of this. I set up the Ouija board again, lighting candles and placing my fingers on the planchette. "Karen, are you there?" I asked. "Yes." "Who were you meeting that night?" I asked, my voice steady. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out a name that made my blood run cold. John. John was my best friend in high school. We did everything together, but he moved away after graduation, and we lost touch. I hadn't thought about him in years. Why was she meeting John? I asked, my voice trembling. Lover. I felt sick. Karen was seeing John behind my back. It didn't make sense. John and I were like brothers. He would never do that to me. But the board was insistent. Lover. What happened to you, Karen? I asked, my voice breaking. The answer came slowly, each letter a dagger to my heart. Betrayed. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the board across the room, the planchette clattering to the floor. This was too much. I needed to find John, to confront him. I needed the truth. I tracked John down online and found his address. He was living in a small town a few hours away. I decided to pay him a visit, to get some answers. I drove through the night, my mind racing with memories and fears. When I arrived, John looked surprised to see me. He welcomed me in, offered me a drink. We talked about old times, but I could see the tension in his eyes. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. John, I need to know the truth, I said. What happened to Karen? John's face went pale. He took a deep breath and looked away. I didn't want to tell you, man. I didn't want to hurt you. Tell me, I demanded. John sighed. Karen and I were seeing each other behind your back. She was going to break up with you that night, but she never showed up. I waited for hours, but she never came. The next day, she was gone. I didn't know what to do. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. Why didn't you tell me? I was scared, John said. I didn't want to lose you as a friend. I didn't know she was missing until the police came asking questions. I stood up, my hands shaking. You're lying. You know more than you're telling me. John shook his head. I swear, that's all I know. I left his house, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The Ouija board, the haunting, John's confession, it was all too much. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what to do next. As I drove back home, I felt a cold presence in the car with me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Karen's ghostly figure sitting in the back seat, her eyes filled with sorrow and pain. Help me, she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I swerved off the road, the car skidding to a halt. I looked back, but she was gone. I sat there, trembling, trying to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't escape her, not until I found out the truth. When I got back to the house, I found the Ouija board waiting for me, the planchette resting on a single word, Murder. My heart raced as I placed my fingers on the planchette once more. Who? I asked, my voice shaking. The answer came quickly, as if she was desperate to tell me. John. I felt a surge of rage. John had lied to me. He knew more than he was letting on. I had to confront him again, to get the truth, no matter the cost. I drove back to John's house, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge and justice. When I arrived, I didn't bother knocking. I kicked the door open and stormed inside, finding John in the living room, a look of shock and fear on his face. What the hell, man? He shouted. You lied to me, I screamed. You killed her. John's face went pale. No, I didn't. I swear I didn't. Then why did the Ouija board say you did? I demanded. John's eyes widened. You used the board. You have no idea what you've done. Before I could respond, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Karen's ghost, her eyes filled with anger and betrayal. You killed me, she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow and pain. John's face contorted with fear. No, I didn't. I loved you. You betrayed me, Karen said, her voice growing louder, more insistent. You betrayed us both. John fell to his knees, sobbing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Karen's ghost reached out, her hand passing through John's chest. He gasped, his eyes wide with terror. I watched in horror as his body convulsed, his skin turning pale and cold. When it was over, John lay lifeless on the floor, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I stood there trembling, my mind racing with thoughts of guilt and horror. I had wanted the truth, but now that I had it, I didn't know what to do. I felt Karen's presence fade away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and fears. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my bags and left, leaving the Ouija board behind. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away, to find some peace. But no matter where I went, I could still feel Karen's presence, still hear her whispers in the dark. I knew I could never escape her, never escape the guilt and horror of what had happened. And deep down, I knew that she would never let me forget. After leaving John's lifeless body behind, I drove aimlessly through the night, my mind a whirlpool of fear and confusion. I couldn't go back to the house, not with the memories and the ghost of Karen haunting every corner. I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere I could think clearly. I ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. It was a dingy place, but it had a bed and a lock on the door, and that was all I needed. I paid for a week in cash, not wanting to leave a trail. I locked myself in the room and collapsed on the bed, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the dirty curtains, casting an eerie glow on the room. I felt disoriented, unsure if the events of the previous night had been a nightmare. But the ache in my heart and the fear in my gut told me it was all too real. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to make sense of everything. I avoided using my phone, paranoid that someone might trace my calls. Instead, I used the motel's payphone to make a few anonymous inquiries. I needed to find out more about John, about Karen, about the night she disappeared. One evening, I decided to visit the local library. I hoped to find some old newspaper archives or any information that could help me piece together the truth. The library was quiet, almost deserted, which suited me just fine. I spent hours going through old newspapers, looking for anything about Karen's disappearance. I finally found an article that caught my eye. It was a small piece, buried in the back pages, but it mentioned that Karen was last seen at a bar with a man who wasn't me. The description matched John. My blood boiled as I read the details. They had argued, witnesses said, and Karen left in tears. John left shortly after, looking agitated. I photocopied the article and stuffed it into my bag. I was about to leave when a voice behind me made me jump. Looking for something, I turned to see an older woman, probably in her 60s, watching me with curious eyes. She had a kind face, but there was something unsettling about her presence. "Just doing some research," I said, trying to sound casual. She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "Researching Karen's disappearance, I see." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How did you know?" She smiled faintly. "I remember the case. It was a big deal around here, such a tragedy. I always thought there was more to the story." "Like what?" I asked, my heart pounding. The woman hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure we were alone. "There were rumors, you know, about a cover-up. People said the police didn't investigate thoroughly because of who was involved." I leaned in closer. "Who?" She looked around again, then whispered, "John's father was a powerful man in this town. He had connections, money, influence. People said he made sure the investigation didn't dig too deep." I felt a surge of anger. "Why would he do that?" The woman shrugged. "Maybe to protect his son. Maybe there's more to it. All I know is, things like this don't just happen without a reason." I thanked her and left the library, my mind racing. If John's father had been involved in a cover-up, it made sense why the investigation had gone nowhere. But what did that mean for Karen? And why was she haunting me? Back at the motel, I spread out the photocopies and notes I'd taken. I needed to make sense of everything, to find some kind of pattern or clue that could explain what was happening. I spent hours going through everything, but it felt like I was missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle. That night, I had another nightmare. I was back in my childhood home, but everything was twisted and dark. I wandered through the house, hearing whispers and seeing shadows move in the corners of my vision. I felt a presence behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Finally, I ended up in the attic where I had found the Ouija board. The board was set up in the center of the room, and the planchette was moving on its own. I watched in horror as it spelled out a single word over and over again, Guilty. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream was trying to tell me something important. I needed to face my guilt, to confront whatever it was that was haunting me. The next morning, I decided to visit my parents' graves. I hadn't been since the funeral, and I felt a deep sense of shame and sorrow as I approached the cemetery. The sky was grey, a fitting backdrop for my mood. I found their graves side by side, marked by simple headstones. I knelt down, feeling a lump in my throat. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." As I sat there, I felt a cold breeze on my neck. I turned to see Karen standing a few feet away, her eyes filled with sorrow. She pointed at the ground in front of her, and I saw something half buried in the dirt. I reached out and pulled it free, my heart pounding. It was a small leather-bound diary. Karen's diary. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. The entries were dated from the weeks leading up to her disappearance. They detailed her growing fear, her suspicions about John, and her plans to confront him. The last entry made my blood run cold. I don't know who to trust anymore. John has been acting strange, and I'm scared. I need to tell someone, but I don't know who. If anything happens to me, please know that I try to do the right thing. I love you all. I felt a surge of anger and determination. Karen had known something dangerous, and she had tried to do the right thing. I needed to find out what it was, to finish what she had started. With the diary in hand, I went back to the motel. I spent the next few days piecing together the clues, following every lead, no matter how small. I discovered that John's father had been involved in some shady business deals, and there were rumours of violence and corruption. But the most disturbing discovery came from an old friend of John's. He contacted me after hearing I was asking questions. He told me that John had confessed to him, years ago, that he had been involved in Karen's disappearance. But he was too scared to come forward, fearing retribution from John's powerful family. Armed with this new information, I knew I had to go to the police, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something I was missing. I decided to use the Ouija board one last time, hoping to get some answers. I set up the board in the motel room, lighting candles and placing my fingers on the planchette. "Karen, are you there?" I asked. "Yes." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved slowly, spelling out a single word. "Find." "Find what?" I asked. "Truth." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Where?" The answer came quickly, as if she was desperate to tell me. "Home." I knew what I had to do. I packed up my things and drove back to my childhood home. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I approached the house, but I knew I had to do this. For Karen, for myself. I searched the house from top to bottom, looking for anything that might be a clue. It wasn't until I reached the attic that I found it. Hidden behind a loose floorboard was a box, dusty and old. I opened it to find letters, photographs, and a tape recorder. I played the tape, my heart pounding. It was a conversation between Karen and John, recorded the night she disappeared. They were arguing, Karen accusing John of something terrible. The tape ended with a loud crash and Karen's terrified scream. I felt sick. This was the proof I needed, the proof that John had lied, that he had been involved in Karen's death. I took the tape and the letters and went straight to the police. They reopened the case, and with the new evidence, they were able to make an arrest. John's father tried to cover it up, but the truth was out. John confessed to everything, to the affair, to the fight, to accidentally killing Karen in a fit of rage. He had hidden her body with his father's help, and they had covered it up ever since. It was over. Karen's ghost stopped haunting me, her presence fading away after the truth came out. But I could never forget what happened. never escaped the guilt and horror of those nights. I moved away, trying to start a new life, but the memories haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice. I knew I could never truly escape the past, but at least now, Karen could rest in peace. And maybe, one day, so could I. I thought that once John was arrested and the truth about Karen's disappearance came out, I could finally find some peace. But I was wrong. The nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. I kept seeing Karen, not as a ghost, but as she was in those final moments, scared, betrayed, and hurt. I woke up every night drenched in sweat, her screams echoing in my ears. The small town where I grew up became unbearable. Everywhere I went, people whispered, stared, and pointed. They looked at me as if I was the one who killed Karen. In a way, they were right. If I had just listened to her, if I hadn't been so blind and selfish, maybe things would have turned out differently. The guilt was crushing, and I needed to get away. I sold the house and moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere. I found a job at a local hardware store and rented a tiny apartment above it. The anonymity was a relief. No one knew me. No one cared about my past. I thought I could finally start over, leave everything behind. But Karen's presence followed me. The first night in my new place, I felt that familiar, cold, suffocating presence. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the Ouija board on the floor next to my bed, even though I had left it behind in the old house. The planchette was moving on its own, spelling out a message over and over again. NERRATORGIVE. I stared at the board, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The planchette moved again, slowly, deliberately. YOU. I threw the board across the room, the planchette clattering to the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I was losing my mind. I spent the next few days in a daze, barely able to function. My co-workers noticed, but I brushed off their concerns. I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. One night, as I was closing up the store, I heard a noise from the back room. It sounded like someone whispering, but the store was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out. The whispers grew louder as I approached, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I found the source of the noise. A tape recorder sitting on a shelf, playing the same tape I had found in the attic. Karen's voice filled the room, accusing John, her screams echoing in the darkness. I ripped the tape out of the recorder and smashed it against the wall, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. "You betrayed me," Karen's voice hissed, filled with anger and sorrow. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." The whispers faded, but the feeling of dread lingered. I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to face whatever was haunting me, once and for all. I decided to visit Karen's grave. I hadn't been since the police found her body and laid her to rest. It was a small, unmarked grave in a secluded part of the cemetery. I brought flowers, feeling a lump in my throat as I approached. "I'm so sorry, Karen," I said, kneeling by her grave. "I should have been there for you. I should have protected you." The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Karen's ghost, her eyes filled with sorrow and pain. She pointed to the ground next to her grave, and I saw a small, dirt-covered box. I dug it up, my hands shaking. Inside the box was a collection of photographs and letters. They were from John, filled with declarations of love and promises to run away together. But there was something else. Photographs of Karen, taken without her knowledge, in various stages of undress. My stomach churned as I realized what they were. Evidence of John's obsession, his twisted love. I took the box to the police, and they reopened the case. With the new evidence, they were able to build a stronger case against John. He was convicted of Karen's murder and sentenced to life in prison, but it didn't bring me any peace. The nightmares continued, the whispers never stopped. I felt Karen's presence everywhere, watching, waiting. I knew I could never escape her. never escape the guilt and horror of what happened. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to find a way to make things right, to put Karen to rest once and for all. I contacted a local medium, a woman named Mrs. Donovan. She had a reputation for being able to communicate with the dead, and I hoped she could help me. She agreed to meet me at my apartment, and I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. Mrs. Donovan was a small, elderly woman with piercing blue eyes. She carried a bag filled with candles, crystals, and other tools of her trade. She set up a small altar in the middle of my living room and instructed me to sit across from her. "We're going to try to contact Karen," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You need to be open and honest. She's been trying to tell you something and you need to listen." I nodded, my heart pounding. Mrs. Donovan lit the candles and began to chant softly. The air grew colder, and I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The room seemed to darken, and I saw Karen's ghostly figure standing behind Mrs. Donovan. "Karen, we're here to help you," Mrs. Donovan said, her eyes closed in concentration. "What do you need?" Karen's voice echoed through the room, filled with sorrow and anger. "He betrayed me. I know," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I should have been there for you." "You can still make it right," Karen said, her voice softer now. "You need to forgive yourself." Tears streamed down my face. "I don't know how." "Let go of the guilt," Karen said. "You did what you could. You brought the truth to light. Now you need to forgive yourself." Mrs. Donovan's eyes opened, and she looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and sadness. "She's right. You need to let go of the past. It's the only way to move forward." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on me. "I'll try," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Karen's ghost smiled, a sad, fleeting smile. "Thank you." The room grew warmer, the shadows receding. I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. Mrs. Donovan extinguished the candles and packed up her things, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to move forward, to let go of the past. Karen's presence faded, but I knew she would always be a part of me. I needed to find a way to honor her memory, to live my life in a way that would make her proud. I started volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who had been through traumatic experiences. It was hard work, but it gave me a sense of purpose. I met people who had suffered in ways I couldn't imagine, and their strength inspired me. Slowly, the nightmares began to fade, the whispers growing quieter. I still saw Karen sometimes, in my dreams, but she wasn't angry anymore. She seemed at peace, and that gave me hope. I knew I could never truly escape the past, but I could learn to live with it. I could find a way to move forward, to forgive myself, and maybe, one day, I could find the peace that Karen had found. But for now, I would keep fighting, keep searching for a way to make things right. It was the least I could do for her, and for myself. Months passed, and life slowly began to regain some semblance of normalcy. The nightmares became less frequent, the whispers more sporadic. I focused on my work at the shelter, finding solace in helping others. But the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. One evening, as I was closing up the shelter, a young woman walked in. She looked disheveled, her clothes torn and dirty, her eyes wide with fear. She said her name was Emily and that she needed help. There was something about her that seemed familiar, something that tugged at the edges of my memory. I offered her a seat and some water, and we began to talk. She told me she'd been living on the streets for months, hiding from something or someone she couldn't fully explain. Her story was disjointed, filled with gaps and inconsistencies, but one thing stood out. She'd been using a Ouija board to try and contact someone from her past. My blood ran cold as she described the messages she had received. They were eerily similar to the ones I had gotten from Karen. "Help me. Trust no one. You did this." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to her. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Emily," I said gently, I need to ask you something. Did you know someone named Karen? Her eyes widened and she nodded slowly. Karen was my sister. She disappeared years ago. I've been trying to find out what happened to her. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Karen had a sister? I had no idea. The guilt and sorrow I thought I had buried came flooding back. I had to help Emily. Had to find a way to give her the answers she deserved. I knew Karen, I said softly. She was a friend of mine. I've been trying to find out what happened to her too. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Do you know anything? Anything that could help me? I took a deep breath and told her everything. About the Ouija board, the haunting, John's confession, and the evidence I'd found. She listened intently, her face a mixture of shock and sadness. I never knew any of this, she whispered. I always thought it was an accident, that she just disappeared. I shook my head. It wasn't an accident. But I don't think we have the whole story yet. There's something more, something we're missing. Emily nodded, determination in her eyes. We need to find out the truth, for Karen. Over the next few days, Emily and I worked together to uncover more about Karen's disappearance. We went through old police reports, talked to people who had known Karen and John, and even visited John's family, who were less than cooperative. One evening, as we were going through some of Karen's old belongings that Emily had kept, we found a hidden compartment in the back of her closet. Inside was a small box, similar to the one I had found at her grave. This one contained more letters, but they were different. They were from Karen to Emily, detailing her fears and suspicions about John and his family. One letter stood out. It was dated the night she disappeared. Emily, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. I'm scared. John's been acting strange, and I think his father is involved in something dangerous. I don't know who to trust. If anything happens to me, please know that I try to do the right thing. I love you, little sister. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she read the letter. She knew, she whispered. She knew something was going to happen. I felt a surge of anger and determination. We needed to take this to the police. With Emily by my side, we went to the station and handed over the new evidence. The detective in charge of the case, Detective Harris, was skeptical at first, but as we laid out everything we had found, his expression changed. This is significant, he said, flipping through the letters. We need to look into this further. The investigation was reopened, and Detective Harris promised to keep us updated. Emily and I waited anxiously, the days stretching into weeks. Every night I felt Karen's presence, urging me to keep going, to find the truth. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise coming from the living room. It sounded like someone whispering. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out to investigate, my heart pounding. The room was empty, but the whispers continued, growing louder. I followed the sound to a corner of the room where the Ouija board was sitting. The planchette was moving on its own, spelling out a message. SHEKNOWS. I stared at the board, my mind racing. Who knows? I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette moved slowly, deliberately. EMILY. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Emily knew something she hadn't told me. I needed to talk to her, to find out what she knew. The next day, I met Emily at the shelter. I told her about the message on the Ouija board, and she looked startled, but not surprised. There's something I haven't told you, she admitted, her voice shaking. I didn't think it was important, but now I'm not so sure. What is it? I asked, feeling a sense of dread. Before Karen disappeared, she told me she was going to meet someone, Emily said. She wouldn't say who, but she seemed scared. She said it was someone she trusted, someone who could help her. Did she give you any clue about who it was? I asked. Emily shook her head. No, but she mentioned a place, an old cabin in the woods, where we used to play as kids. She said she was meeting them there. I felt a surge of hope. We need to go there. Maybe there's something there, something that can give us the answers we need. Emily agreed, and we made plans to go to the cabin the next day. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as we drove out to the woods, the sun setting behind us. The cabin was old and abandoned, covered in vines and moss. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The air was musty, filled with the scent of decay. We searched the cabin, looking for any clues, but found nothing. I was about to give up when Emily called out from the back room. "I found something!" I rushed over to find her standing in front of an old, dust-covered chest. Inside were more letters and photographs, similar to the ones we had found before. But these were different. They were addressed to someone named David. "Who's David?" I asked, flipping through the letters. "I don't know," Emily said, her brow furrowed. "I've never heard of him." The letters were filled with details about Karen's fears, her suspicions about John and his father. But they also mentioned David, someone Karen seemed to trust, someone she thought could help her. I felt a surge of anger and frustration. We were so close, but still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. As we were about to leave, I noticed something sticking out from under the floorboards. I pried it up to find a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a diary, Karen's diary. We sat down and began to read, the pages filled with Karen's thoughts and fears. She wrote about John's obsession, his father's influence, and her growing suspicion that they were involved in something dangerous. But the most chilling entry was the last one. "David is the only one I can trust. He knows something important. I'm meeting him at the cabin tonight. If anything happens to me, please find him. He can help you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. We needed to find David, whoever he was. He was the key to uncovering the truth, to putting Karen's spirit to rest once and for all. As we left the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I knew we were on the right track, but the danger was far from over. Emily and I spent the next few days trying to track down David. We scoured old yearbooks, contacted mutual friends, and even hired a private investigator. Finally, we got a lead. David was living in a small town a few hours away, under a different name. We drove out to meet him, our hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. When we found him, he looked older, more weathered, but there was a kindness in his eyes that put us at ease. We told him everything, and he agreed to help. David revealed that he had been working with Karen to gather evidence against John and his father. He had been her confidant, her ally, but when she disappeared, he went into hiding, fearing for his own life. With David's help, we gathered the final pieces of evidence we needed. We took everything to Detective Harris, who was able to build an airtight case. John's father was arrested, and the full extent of their crimes was revealed. They had been involved in human trafficking, drug dealing, and countless other atrocities. The truth finally came out, and Karen's spirit found peace. But I knew I could never fully escape the past. The memories, the guilt, and the horror would always be with me. But I had found a way to live with it, to honor Karen's memory by helping others. Emily and I grew closer through the ordeal, finding solace in each other's company. We knew we had a long road ahead of us, but we were determined to face it together. And as I lay in bed that night, the whispers finally silenced. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I knew Karen was watching over us, and that gave me the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for the truth. But deep down, I knew the darkness was never far away, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I vowed to be ready, to face it head on, no matter what the future held. Months turned into years, and life slowly found a rhythm. Emily and I stayed in touch, our bond growing stronger as we navigated the aftermath of uncovering the truth about Karen's disappearance. The shelter became a sanctuary for both of us, a place where we could channel our grief and guilt into something positive. One evening, as we were closing up the shelter, Emily and I decided to visit Karen's grave. It had been a long time since we'd been there, and we wanted to pay our respects. The sky was overcast, a soft drizzle falling as we made our way to the cemetery. We stood in silence for a while, each lost in our thoughts. The past few years had been a whirlwind of emotions, and standing there, I felt a sense of closure. Emily placed a bouquet of flowers on Karen's grave, her eyes filled with tears. "She deserved so much better," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I wish I could have done more." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "We did everything we could. Karen knows that. She's at peace now." Emily nodded, wiping away her tears. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." "We have to stick together," I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's what Karen would have wanted." As we walked back to the car, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if Karen's spirit was finally at rest, and I could start to move forward. But peace has a way of being fleeting. A few nights later, I woke up to the familiar feeling of a cold, suffocating presence in my room. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't Karen. It was Emily. Her eyes were wide and empty, her skin pale and bruised. She pointed at me, her mouth opening in a silent scream. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room grew colder, the shadows darker. Emily vanished as suddenly as she appeared, but the terror lingered. I knew I had to talk to her. I called her the next morning, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She sounded groggy, as if she hadn't slept all night. "Emily, we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's wrong." She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. When she arrived, she looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. I told her about the vision, about seeing her ghost in my room. "It wasn't a dream," I said, my voice low. "I know it wasn't." Emily looked scared, but she nodded. "I've been having nightmares too, about Karen, about that night. It's like something is haunting me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "We need to figure out what's going on. Maybe there's something we missed, something we need to do." We decided to visit Mrs. Donovan, the medium who had helped me before. She welcomed us into her home, her eyes filled with concern as we told her about our experiences. "There's something more," she said, her voice thoughtful, "something unfinished. Karen's spirit may be at rest, but there are still lingering shadows." We set up a séance, hoping to contact Karen one last time. The room grew colder as Mrs. Donovan began to chant, the candles flickering in the darkness. I felt a familiar chill, and Karen's ghostly figure appeared before us. "Karen, we need your help," I said, my voice trembling. "Emily is being haunted. We need to know why." Karen's eyes were filled with sorrow. "There is another. Someone who hasn't found peace." "Who?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. The answer came slowly, as if it pained Karen to say it. John. I felt a surge of anger. John's spirit was still haunting us, still causing pain even from beyond the grave. "What do we need to do?" I asked, my heart pounding. Karen's voice was soft but firm. "Forgive him." I stared at her, incredulous. "Forgive him? After everything he did?" Karen nodded. "It's the only way. Forgive him and set him free." I took a deep breath, feeling a weight pressing down on my chest. Forgiving John was the last thing I wanted to do, but if it was the only way to put an end to this nightmare, I had to try. Emily and I drove to the prison where John was being held. We arranged a meeting, and when he walked into the room, I felt a wave of anger and hatred. He looked older, more haggard, but there was a defiance in his eyes that made my blood boil. "What do you want?" he sneered, sitting down across from us. "We came to forgive you," I said, my voice shaking with anger and determination. John laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Forgive me? After everything I did?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice steady. "Karen told us it's the only way. We need to forgive you to set you free." John's expression changed, a flicker of fear and sadness crossing his face. "I don't deserve it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Maybe not, I said, my voice softening. But we need to do this. For Karen. For ourselves. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the past pressing down on us. Finally, I took a deep breath and spoke the words I never thought I would say. I forgive you, John. Emily echoed my words, her eyes filled with tears. I forgive you. John's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded slowly. Thank you, he whispered, his voice filled with sorrow and regret. As we left the prison, I felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. The nightmares didn't stop immediately, but they became less frequent, less intense. I knew it would take time, but I felt hopeful for the first time in years. Emily and I continued our work at the shelter, finding solace and purpose in helping others. We knew we couldn't change the past, but we could make a difference in the present. And as I lay in bed each night, I felt Karen's presence watching over us, a silent guardian, finally at peace. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over me. I had faced my demons, and I had found a way to move forward. Life would never be the same, but I had learned to live with the past, to honor Karen's memory by living a life she would be proud of. And with Emily by my side, I knew I could face whatever the future held. The darkness would always be there, but so would the light. And as long as I held on to that, I knew I could find a way to keep going, to keep fighting for the truth, no matter what.